And our next speaker is Glenn Anderau, who is a PhD student in philosophy at the University of Zurich, who works in social epistemology, specifically about fake news. The floor is yours.
Yeah, so can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So welcome to my presentation, and thanks also for the invitation and for the audience. So my presentation is on passive testimony and kind of exploring social media as an epistemic environment. I start with kind of an initial question, which is why is social media especially conducive to epistemically toxic content, or why is it spread there often? So this also kind of includes the premise that social media is especially conducive to epistemically toxic content. What it shouldn't apply, of course, is that epistemically toxic content is exclusive to social media, or that social media is purely negative, or is purely negative from an epistemic standpoint, even though I will be focusing on the negative parts in this presentation. And what I also will not spend too much time doing, just for time reasons, is defining what is epistemically toxic content. I think for the purposes of this presentation, we can work with kind of a broad definition of that. If we suspect something might be epistemically toxic content, then it probably belongs into the category. I have kind of four parts. First, I want to explore a notion of testimony, which is passive testimony. So a form of testimony I think is not explored as much in epistemology. Then look at social media as an epistemic environment, look at social media testimony, and then also the dangers of passive testimony on social media. What is the motivation for this? So first of all, yes, I want to kind of introduce this notion of passive testimony, then explore the epistemic environment of social media. Then specifically, I want to understand better the rules which govern social media testimony, in particular what it means when we share and like content. And I also would like to kind of propose new norms for that. And finally, I want to look at the dangers of passive testimony in social media, especially with regards to epistemically toxic content. Now, testimony in general is something which is a source of knowledge, or knowledge that we derive from based on the statements of others. Kind of highlights the social dimension of knowledge, which is why it's an important concept in social epistemology. It highlights the epistemic reliance on others that we have based on Goldberg. Now, of course, in philosophy and in epistemology, it's quite controversial to say how and in what way knowledge can be derived from testimony, or which beliefs that we have that are derived from testimony or are justified. So for this presentation, I just want to content myself with saying that we do derive beliefs based on the statements of others. So we have beliefs that are kind of that have testimony as its source. Now, in the normal discussion of testimony, in the classic concept, we have the idea that we need the active participation of the recipient. So if I am inquiring into the question whether it's raining outside and I can't go outside myself, I could be asking a person who's just been outside if it's raining, and then based on their statement, I can form a belief. Or I could consult kind of a written belief, like I could consult the weather, the weather service, and base my belief on that. But what I'm arguing is that there could be kind of a passive form of testimony in which the recipient isn't really taking an active role. So the recipient of passive testimony is not actively inquiring into a question, and is also not attentively consuming the testimonial evidence at hand. To give you an example of this, so an example of passive testimony, which is also on social media, we have the example of Fred, who's like absentmindedly scrolling through his Facebook feed, which contains a post announcing the wedding of his high school friend Debbie. He's not really close to this person. He's not actively inquiring into whether Debbie is married or not, and he pays really little attention to this social media post while he's scrolling through his Facebook feed. However, if he's asked later, or maybe like 2 weeks later, about Debbie, he has formed the belief that Debbie has gotten married recently, even if he's unsure where he has heard this information. So here we have an example of someone forming a belief without actively kind of inquiring into a question and without actively engaging with the testimonial evidence that they're presented with. What I would argue is that such passive testimony cases are quite common, and they're especially common on social media, where kind of the way we're presented with information really lends itself to passive testimony, because the information we're presented with is not necessarily answering a question we asked or we're interested in, and we're also we're also kind of just kind of given, or we're prone to just scroll through this deluge of information that we have without paying close attention to everything. One last kind of idea I want to introduce related to testimony is that of epistemic credit, which is introduced by Cavall, who argues that reliable testifiers should receive some form of epistemic credit. So the idea here is that if you're a reliable testifier, then you can you're kind of helping the spread of knowledge or the formation of true beliefs. And then what I would argue is that if this is true, bad and unreliable testifiers should also receive some form of epistemic discredit or demerit if their testimony leads to false beliefs. And I think this is especially true if their testimony consists of kind of epistemically toxic content. And I think it's also true even if it is only received in the form of passive testimony. Now, next, I would like to look at social media as an epistemic environment. So I think social media is very interesting as an epistemic environment. In general, epistemic environments can exist in many forms. So a classroom could be an epistemic environment where we really have clear roles of how knowledge should be transmitted. Unlike other epistemic environments, social media is not a physical space, and it really is set up to have a lot of anonymous interactions, and it kind of leads to a lot of anonymity. The other remarkable thing about social media is just the large amount of participants and how vast it is. So there are almost 4 billion social media users worldwide. Facebook has 2.7 billion monthly active users, so it's really just a huge space. And of course, social media can be divided into numerous smaller epistemic environments, including my own social media feed is kind of an epistemic environment for me. And what I already hinted at is that much of the testimony on social media is passive, and that it has kind of a form that encourages passive testimony. The other thing that's kind of striking is that the rules governing testimony in social media are unclear. We don't have kind of established norms or even etiquette, and that is confusing. And I think it's particularly confusing regarding 2 acts, which is sharing or liking content on social media. And the question there that is really unclear is the sharing or liking of content on social media meant to be seen as an endorsement? So if I share a fake news article or something on social media, does that mean I'm endorsing it? There's not a lot of discussion on this in academia. I think one of the few philosophers who actually mentions this is Regina Rini, who, if I saw correctly, is also here in the audience. Not sure, maybe we can confirm that later. But in general, there doesn't seem to be kind of a widespread consensus or even debate on what we are meant to do with the sharing or liking of content as a testimonial act, and whether that is an endorsement. What we see a lot is this kind of blanket statement of a retweet is not an endorsement as a kind of disclaimer on social media profiles. It functions as kind of a blanket disclaimer. It's almost a kind of a legal disclaimer, although it is not necessarily aimed at law enforcement or the legal system. So an example of this is Jordan Peterson, who is a kind of a controversial public figure who might have an interest in staving off criticism for the content he shares online or social media accounts. And another is just, I found it funny because it is also a kind of the official Twitter account of a city. So also there's an interest here of kind of inoculating yourself against criticism. Now, what I would say is it's quite unsatisfactory to not be sure what to do with this liking and sharing of content on social media. So I have like a tentative proposal for how we should read them. And this would be the following, which is that the sharing and liking of content on social media should be taken as an endorsement unless the content is explicitly disavowed in the sharing process. And blanket disclaimers, such as, retweet is not an endorsement, are not strong enough as disavowals. The burden of proof, so to speak, should lie with the person sharing content on social media. And the kind of the disavowal should really be attached to the sharing of content. So if I'm retweeting something or posting something on Facebook and I don't want to approve of it, I really need to make this clear in the same post. Now, why should we kind of take this as an endorsement? I think the reason for that is that when we have testimony on social media, it can have really adverse consequences, even if it is a passive social media testimony. And I think this is especially true with regards to epistemically toxic content, such as fake news, for instance. There are studies that show that the exposure to fake news can modify our unconscious behavior, even if it is kind of just a really brief exposure. And then spreading epistemically toxic content in particular on social media should lead to some kind of epistemic demerit for the testifier, even if it is only with regard to passive testimony. Who else might be responsible? I think the social media companies or platforms themselves might share some responsibility. They're obviously not necessarily endorsing everything which is shared on their platform, but they do have some level of responsibility for the content shared on their platforms. And I do think they deserve epistemic demerit for enabling the spread of epistemically toxic content, especially if it is extremely widespread and if they could do more to prevent the spread of it. There is some data on this. So there's an estimation that about 10.1 billion impressions of misinformation could have been prevented on Facebook in the 8 months prior to the 2020 US presidential election. So I think we already had this in the debate before in the Q&A that people are interested in this. So there is quite a vast amount of misinformation that was spread online in the run-up to the 2020 US presidential election. And this estimate also says that Facebook could have prevented this amount of impressions if they had adopted kind of a policy on misinformation, which they have adopted now in the aftermath of the election, but not in the lead up to it. And also this is the 2020 US presidential election, so not the 2016 election in which Trump got elected. So I would argue probably to prevent the spread of epistemically toxic content, you would need some kind of regulation or sort of like political regulation of social media companies. However, I understand that this kind of regulation comes with significant political risks and concerns about free speech and the overreach of power, and therefore may not be desirable. I can't really answer this question. In epistemology, there is the concept of epistemic environmentalism, which allows us to speak normatively about epistemic environments and how to better them. But even in this field, there's kind of division on whether state intervention is desirable to create better epistemic environments. So I really can't answer the question, what is the lesser evil or what is worse here? But what I do kind of want to highlight is just the dangers of passive social media testimony in particular. So why is the passive spread of epistemically toxic content so harmful? On the one hand, it preys on and exploits certain cognitive biases human agents are susceptible to. One of them is the repetition effect. I think one of the presentations we already talked about that. So it is the idea that if a statement is repeated several times, we are more likely to believe it. And given kind of the vast amount of misinformation, which we saw is spread on social media, this might be a concern because people might be confronted with these claims several times. I also wanted to imagine scenarios where the passive spread of epistemically toxic content could be even worse or more pervasive than its active spread. And I have an example here that we could think about. So it's a fake news example, again, with regards to the 2020 US election. So we have Max, who is scrolling through his Facebook feed. Again, several of his friends share fake news stories which allege that the 2020 US election was stolen. Max himself is not greatly interested in politics, and he only really sees the headlines of these fake news articles in his feed while he's scrolling through. If he were to click on the links initially, he might have dismissed the claims in the fake news article because the fake news itself is kind of badly written. It doesn't present any credible sources for its claims. However, because he does not click on the links, but then is repeatedly exposed to this kind of articles passively in his social media feed, he does eventually form the belief that it is likely that voter fraud occurred in the 2020 US election. Now, to show you that, again, this example is maybe not as far-fetched, there's actually quite a sizable number of the American population which does believe certain misinformation about the 2020 US election. So in October 2020, it was 44% of registered voters, or roughly 91 million people, who had seen false claims about mail-in voter fraud on Facebook, and 35% of them actually believed them. And again, if you look at just the top 100 most popular false or misleading stories on Facebook, again, with regards to the 2020 elections, those received about 162 million views. So, so there's really a very large amount of just misinformation that is out there. And I think it's very likely that of this 44 or 35%, there's not a large percentage of them that were actively spreading this news. And there's probably a very sizable amount, maybe even a majority, that wasn't actively engaging with this news either, but that was just kind of passively exposed to it. As we saw in the talk before, so this is actually based on the first paper that Sasha Altai presented just before. People are quite good at recognizing fake news, and they do epistemically discredit those who share it. However, if I understood this correctly, at least in these studies, we are seeing people who are actively engaging with fake news articles and kind of actively inquiring into the question whether these stories are fake news or not. Their attention is drawn to this question. And so the question is, what happens when they're not actively doing that? The other problem that we have is, again, what I mentioned, the repetition effect. And what is striking about it is that the repetition effect still kind of comes into play if people have prior knowledge or beliefs to the contrary. And even if they know that the source making these claims is not particularly reliable. So even in these cases, there is at least some kind of repetition effect, that if we are exposed to a claim more often, it still becomes a little bit more likely that we believe it. So this, to me, suggests that with epistemically toxic content, we might have two intended audiences, an active one, which is much smaller in number and which is supposed to actively share and reproduce epistemically toxic content, and then a passive one, which is a much larger group, which might actually not be that susceptible to epistemically toxic content, such as fake news, in active testimony when they're actively engaging with it, but that might be harmed by it passively. So the idea here is also that even if the passive spread of epistemically toxic content does not lead to false beliefs outright, it could still poison the well epistemically, so it could still make people less likely to believe true beliefs. I think what also could be said, especially with fake news, is that the passive spread is not just a mere side effect, but it's deliberately being exploited. So it's not a bug, it's a feature of fake news, that it doesn't only want to reach its active group, but it wants to reach a larger group. And it's actually quite happy if they don't engage too directly with this, with fake news in this case. So kind of the last point is that epistemically toxic content is often compared to kind of other forms of disinformation like propaganda, lies, Frankfurtian bullshit. This is especially true for fake news. But I think there may be two other concepts that would be interesting to compare it to, which are rumors and advertising. And I think especially in the case of advertising, this idea of having a really large and like vast deluge of information that kind of banks on being consumed passively for the most part might be really similar. And then just to kind of sum this up, so what, as it's kind of what is the takeaway of what I said in this presentation? So there is a passive form of testimony which does not require active inquiry or attention by the recipient, or attention to the testimonial sources by the recipient of testimony. The epistemic environment of social media lends itself to the passive spread of content, including especially toxic content such as fake news. The norms of social media testimony regarding the liking and sharing of content are unclear, and I propose that we should take the liking and sharing of content on social media as an endorsement unless explicitly disavowed. Epistemically toxic content such as fake news can benefit from being spread passively. And yeah, there are a lot of people who are unlikely to believe epistemically toxic content such as fake news if they receive it actively, but they might be more susceptible to the passive exposure to it. So thanks for your attention. That was my presentation, and now I'm really looking forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's see. We have two participants raised hand. So let's start with Isaac.
All right, thanks, Glenn. That was really interesting. I think you're absolutely right that one of the big problems here is that we're all confused about the norms. I'm really interested in your proposal that things should be taken as endorsements unless explicitly disavowed. I'm interested in the two possible problems with that disavowal. The first is how to signal that clearly, especially in these cases of passive testimony. It seems like someone might see the, shared GIF or image and miss the couple of words that someone says, like, what a bad take or whatever they say to disavow. The other is in the cases when someone wants to do something similar to like Frankfurtian bullshitting, where they actually want to like float a test balloon and not give away their commitment to this claim, but rather see what the reaction is. Your proposals suggest that we don't allow that kind of discussion anymore. And I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, so thank you very much for those questions. I think they're very interesting. So for the first question, I think, yes, this is actually just another kind of problem of passive testimony. So even an explicit disavowal might not be seen. However, I do think that an explicit disavowal that is kind of attached to the post itself, maybe not just in the bio, might be kind of more direct and more helpful and more likely to be seen actively than maybe just putting this in the biography or saying, yeah, I'm not responsible for anything I share. So in that sense, I just think it would still be better. But yes, it is definitely a concern. And for the second question, so this idea of, should we allow people to just float ideas into space and then see what happens? I think this would be kind of harder to do under my proposed norms. I don't know if that's necessarily a problem relating to epistemically toxic content. I think, if you're really sharing a fake news article, maybe you shouldn't even just float that out as an idea to see what happens. So I'm a little less concerned about that not being possible. But it's true that it would become more difficult.
Okay, thank you. Next question is Neri.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Thank you. So my question is again about the endorsement idea. And I've written a paper myself for retweeting. And in this paper, I discuss a bit how we could interpret and whether this default endorsement idea is plausible. And one problem I outline about that is that we have evidence that a large part of what is shared on this social media is not sentential content, and even the content that are sentences, only 1/3 are assertions of something that someone can agree with. So the idea that we might have a default interpretation as endorsement seems to be countered by the fact that most of what we have in this social media is not something that we can endorse. So I was wondering if you have something to say about that.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the question. First of all, I'm very interested in your paper, so I would be really grateful if you could like send me the link to that or something.
I'll send you an email.
Or
Thank you very
just
much.
post a link in the chat, maybe, so we can all see your paper.
I will.
Yeah, so I would be very interested in that. I'm sorry for not finding that and mentioning it. I really didn't find this kind of in my research. So I would say the problem of here would be that we just have kind of like empty content that is being shared that doesn't really assert anything. So I would argue that isn't really a problem. So of course, maybe it would be kind of bizarre to say that that is an endorsement of this empty content that doesn't assert anything. But I feel like there's also not a lot of harm in that, right? I mean, this empty content, I assume for the most part, isn't epistemically toxic content. I do think, however, that even things that are not sentences, so even if I'm sharing maybe a picture or a meme or something like that, there might be the question that I am kind of endorsing a position or asserting something with that. And in those cases, I just think the endorsement clause could come in. Maybe it would be better to specify that if nothing is asserted in the content shared, then yeah, I mean, of course, there's also nothing to endorse. But I would argue with the kind of epistemically toxic content, which is what I'm really concerned about, so fake news and things like that. There is a certain assertion if something is shared, and at least if you are kind of sharing or liking epistemically toxic content, then maybe some kind of responsibility should lie with you, and we should take it as an endorsement in those instances.
Okay, last question, Axel.
Yeah, great. Thanks very much. Really a fascinating talk. Lots of food for thought. I just wanted to sort of go back to one of the early points you made, and that's that fundamental distinction between passive testimony and active testimony, which I find really interesting. And I think it can really sort of speak to many debates also within more traditional epistemology of testimony. I mean, this idea that sort of the prototypical case of testimony is one where we are face to face and really figuring out whether someone really, really means it. That's very atypical. In fact, this broad reliance on the social environment seems to be more like the passive testimony. But the example you gave, I wasn't exactly sure about. You mentioned, you scroll through feed, you see old distant friend got married, and then a few weeks later you report that to someone. If the difference is that if the sole difference is that we don't remember what the source of that original belief is, then that would, to me, seem to be too weak, because, I mean, the kind of lack of source attribution or some sort of mild source amnesia, if you like, seems to be far too common to make that the criterion. So I was wondering what else makes the difference between active testimony and passive testimony on your account.
Yeah, thank you a lot for that question. And yeah, so I mean, I actually maybe shouldn't have included the kind of the fact that you might not remember the source in the example, because I think it's not essential to what passive testimony is, at least for me. And of course, yeah, I mean, like not remembering the source or even inquiring into a question might just be a fault of memory. So for me, I think the only two things that make it passive testimony is that, yeah, so we did kind of form a belief based on testimonial sources, but we didn't actively inquire into the question, and we didn't kind of actively engage or really attentively pay attention to the testimonial sources at hand.
Okay, great, thanks.